You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Danielle Park, editor of the popular blog Juggling Dynamite and president of Venable Park Investment Council Incorporated. Welcome to the show, Danielle.
Good afternoon, Jim.
In just a few days, the majority of Canadians, we hope, will go to the ballot box and cast their choice. You're saying we could have a constitutional crisis depending on the outcome of that vote, especially if it turns out to be essentially a three-way tie.
Well, yeah, actually it was brought to my attention by an article this week just pointing out that in the event that there is a tie or no clear majority, Democracy Watch issued a statement just pointing out that there are no clear rules set down yet in Canada for the process by which the Governor-General would basically break the impasse. And in other countries, Australia, New Zealand, other democracies, there is a clear set of rules set down in advance so that if you ever get to a point where the Governor-General has to actually help break an impasse or help make a decision or have discretion with respect to how the next government is formed because the polls come back not definitive enough, or sorry, not the polls, the election results don't come in, definitive enough to give one party a majority. The Governor-General has a lot of say in that, and in this case, in Canada, there's been no rules prescribed, and that could be, it's very unnerving for any democracy. The rule of law requires there be transparency and due process, clearly defined in advance of everything so that everyone knows the rules before, and is not left to just discretion or political pressure or, the opinion of one particular, one arbitrary decision maker. And so that is just another example of how Canada, I think, really has slipped considerably in its democratic principles over the past 10 years. I think that, there's been a definite assault on freedom of information, transparency, communication, many of the things that we've traditionally have always been key foundations to a free and open democracy. So these are the things that I think people have to take very seriously when they consider how they're voting on Monday.
Well, just looking at the selfie world, I see a lot of people getting selfies with Justin Trudeau. I don't see any with Harper.
Well, I've been to 3 debates in my area, and at each of those debates, the Conservative candidates were booed almost consistently throughout. And I don't know if that's a reflection of just general frustration, whether it's an example of, a government that's been in for, nearly 3 full terms already. And I think that whoever has been in power, once there's been economic problems come up in the economy, basically whoever's in leadership gets the blame for that. So it could be a lot of that frustration coming out. But I think that there is a lot of concern about some of the, curtailing of these rights and freedoms as Canadians see them, and that I think is what seems to be the hot button. So we'll see what happens Monday. I have no insight either way, but my own perception, and I was watching the Democratic debate in the United States in Vegas this week. I don't know if you caught any of that, Jim, but, the front runners being Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, and the discussion there, I think people are listening for some shakeup, like an absolute change, from what we've had as the status quo. And I think that in that case, the person that represented the status quo, for example, in the Democratic Party would be Hillary Clinton. Because she already, her and her husband were already in the White House, because she already has very long-standing affiliations with, for example, the finance sector, which people are very angry about in general, and I think should be really angry about. I mean, it's one of the things, as you know, that I write about all the time, is how big, bold, and ungovernable the finance sector has really become in the last 15 years, and it's really calling the shots and dominating policy and driving the world economy into the ditch repeatedly. And we need some massive shakeup in the power structure that will help to cut that back into smaller pieces. And only Bernie Sanders and there was another representative that was talking about bringing back Glass-Steagall and, ending the control that the large banks have on the government. And Hillary Clinton, of course, is not saying that because, as Nomi Prinz was writing, the one who's written all the president's bankers, she's written this piece on Hillary Bill and the big six banks, and she's just talking about how the Clintons have had this long-standing affiliation with Wall Street and how that really does represent the status quo. So we'll see. I'm skeptical because I think that the tentacles of finance have got into all the main parties at this point. I think that the Liberals are susceptible to the same, potential corruption in that regard as the Conservatives have been in Canada. And, that's where we go back to the antitrust issues and why we need to break up these too big to fail institutions so that they don't have the political clout and control that they have been abusing over the past many years. So anyway, I just hope that it's some massive shakeup. That's I'm not really rooting for any particular party in that regard. I think that what we need is a change, and governments that have been in place too long need to be shaken up every once in a while to try and get some meaningful, results or change accomplished.
I know Harper wants to go into the history books as the only Canadian Prime Minister to be elected to 4 terms.
Yeah. Well, we shall see, right? We shall see. I think it's encouraging that many people have already voted in the pre polls, and what was it, a 70% increase or something?
71.
Prior?
Yeah, but
so
what was disturbing in Vancouver is there were long lineups outside those advanced polls, and they closed the doors. Now, is this again a government policy? Because they cut Elections Canada's budget. So they didn't get the number of ads out before. In fact, they were told before the election was called they couldn't run any ads promoting how to vote, where to vote, why to vote. And don't forget, the Conservatives have been convicted of the robocall scandal where people were called and told, your polling station is closed, go to this one. And of course, they show up at that school or church, and that isn't the real polling station. And by the time they find out there's a mistake, the real one is closed. Have they done this?
It's mind-boggling, isn't it? It's mind-boggling that people in a country like Canada, I mean, we're not talking about some, emergent democracy or dictatorship. It's amazing how people will go to such steps to thwart the democratic process. Even on our street, my neighbor was telling me that his signs and his neighbor's signs, which were different parties, by the way, have both been ripped out of their front lawn and thrown in the ditch, ripped up and thrown away now 3 different times. And you think of what kind of a mind is walking their dog down a peaceful street at night and thinks that it's fine to rip out someone's political expression like that and throw it in the ditch. It's mind-boggling. But I think we just have to keep pushing forward and insisting on transparency, objective rules, fair disclosure. We have to have the rule of law. We have to have everybody subject to the same, penalties and offenses. We just have to keep pushing forward. I think these dark chapters come and go in human history, and the more complacent people are, the more they lose typically in terms of the erosion of those hard fought for freedoms and divisions.
Well, you don't want to say the judiciary in Canada is being interfered with, but I found it suspicious the Mike Duffy trial was all of a sudden adjourned until after the election.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. You know what else concerns me is the media. We've been talking for many years about the erosion of journalistic principles and ethics, and the really the replacing of that with these media franchises, which are essentially controlled by their sponsors. And since the financial industry, for example, is one of the most powerful groups in the world and has been the most profitable thanks to the bailouts and all these easy conditions they've been granted, the license to print money literally. They have become this monster that has all these funds, and they therefore can dominate sponsorship of major media outlets, which have been losing eyeballs, right? They've been having a shrinking audience over the past many years as people have gone to seek out alternative sources of information and news via the internet, et cetera. So the main media composites are all sort of driven by party lines, and so you see a lot of a very controlled message. You know, a lot of if you look at things like the retail sales reports, as an example, retail sales have been horrible in the last while, and the recent report was very negative as well. And you tend to find that in the main media outlets now, those negative news stories on the economy are buried or massaged or blamed on innocuous things like weather, or downplayed, so that you keep this bullish message going at all times. And there's no truth police really on the beat here. To call out and say, wait a minute, that's not a balanced representation, or that's not accurate, or quit interviewing the same 6 bank people for their take, because they're long always, and they're always going to be bullish, and they're in the business of selling hope and enthusiasm about securities to the general public. So if you let them always be the ones you're interviewing on these statistics or on the numbers, the public isn't getting a fair and balanced reporting of anything. So we've seen that, over the years, the last few years in particular, especially since 2008, we've seen a very steady erosion of any fair reporting. And even the CBC in Canada, as you know, Jim, has been, in that long tradition of public broadcasting, has been eroded, funding been cut, and they have had to turn to things like advertising and sponsors, and you really do see that in the message. It starts to become much more biased, much less rounded, and just less useful in general as information. And
there is a fact-checking website in Canada. In fact, I think it's called Fact.ca or Fact.ca, where you can put in a political statement and it will tell you if that's true or not. Now, I don't know who's behind that website, though, and if what they are saying is true.
It's true. Well, we can become intellectually lazy. It's quite common for all of us because we have our own busy life or our own areas, and we don't have the time or the interest, frankly, sometimes to go and do our own due diligence on every single aspect of life, right? So we do, in many ways, find ourselves migrating to certain sources as the filter to see what is a sort of an unbiased or objective assessment of someone's position. And so, for example, the David Suzuki Foundation sent out, I thought was quite helpful, a assessment of the major parties, all 4 major parties, and their stance on different environmental issues, and put it in a handy-dandy table so people could see, who's for different aspects. I think that kind of thing, I find myself looking at filters. I think it's the way in which people use my blog in many cases. They come to someone they think is a reputable, unbiased assessor, expert in a particular area, and try and get their read, because they just don't have time to do all that sort of due diligence themselves. But it does make us vulnerable when we make those leaps of faith to who we're taking that information from. But it's a tricky bit of business, all of it. One of the things that I dislike about the liberal message, as an example, is I tend to be fiscally conservative. Not conservative on social issues, but conservative on finances. I don't like that. I do like working within budgets. And one of the things that the Liberals have said is that they will roll back the CPP to 65, and they won't have it at 67. I think it's a terrible idea. The demographics of society suggest that we're living longer, that we need, to have a later start date to these publicly funded pensions. Otherwise, we have to increase dramatically the contributions, and no one, of course, is much interested in dramatically increasing contributions. So, there's just certain things, as I say, I have a hard time being madly in love with any particular party, but I do think at this point a shake-up of some kind is needed.
I have found that website. It's called factscan.ca, and 3 latest statements from Stephen Harper, This is the first government in Canadian history that, faced with a recession, did not cut our immigration. FaxCan says that is false. Prime Minister Harper, we have not taken away health care from immigrants and refugees. On the contrary, the only time we've removed it is if we have clearly bogus refugees who have been refused and turned down. Faxcan.ca says that is a false statement. Stephen Harper, the past 10 years was a period of unprecedented economic instability. Well, that is true, according to Faxcan.ca. And by the way, people ask me, how do I know if what my candidate has said is true or false? This is a very good place to go.
Well, it seems to be a source to get another take for sure. I think fast and loose is pretty common too in the heat of these debates that are so televised and all about, the sound bites. It's hard for, I guess, I look at it this way. What I know really well is finance and investment commentary and the biases within my own industry. And I would say that almost all the time when someone is talking, within a second or two, I can, underline where they're coming from, why they're saying what they're saying, the weakness in their argument, the bias in their argument. It's quite easy when you're inside a particular issue. And I think that in many cases, being a lawyer too, I'm also trained that you can argue both sides of an issue, right? So it's very rare that something is black and white. It's very often gray, and very, very, little political process focuses on the actual math of things. It's mostly about what will be a hot topic or attract public, attention or support. And I think that that's the problem, is that we're all placated with these short-term, candies, if you will, to entice our vote or entice our support towards a particular party or candidate, when really what we need to be doing is playing the long game, which is all about, 5, 10, 15, 20 years out. And very few people are interested in that kind of patience and that kind of deferred gratification and building, investment for the future, even if it means short-term pain, setting aside cash flow from today, not for immediate needs, but for future needs. I think the human animal is particularly poorly designed, let's put it that way, for the long game. And sadly, I think that's what we need to be playing so much right now, is always thinking about, what can we do to make the world a better place 10 and 15 years from now, more than just next week and next year.
And of course, your baby boomers are going, what do I care about 20 years from now? I won't be alive.
Well, I was writing about that in the past few years quite a bit, because we know that the primary cohort of voters comes from that 50-plus range, age group, and that 50-plus age group is the ones that are, getting to the taking money out of the pot phase. As they enter the taking money out of the pot phase, they're much more inclined to vote for things that are in their own self-interest. It's natural. They don't have a lot of timeline left in their lifespan for these things to work out per se. The problem with the boomers as in general, and I don't mean to be, harsh on individuals who may not be part of this general category, but in general, boomers have not saved and paid forward things. They have very much been about present-day consumption and gratification, and so they've been particularly poor stewards of future needs. And now they're coming in as a mass and as a massive force in the political process, and voting in things that are self-serving again. And so while that may be natural, as I say, entering your later years, to think about your own, maintenance and who's going to pay your health care and your pensions and all that, at the end of the day, if you didn't put in, you have a problem, because there's not enough money in the pot. And that's where we're at today.
We'll have more with Danielle Park right after the break.
More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Danielle Park. Let's get out of election mode and talk about, I was going to say reality. What could be more real than an election if the results are actually accurate? On your blog, you said Exxon knew back in the 1970s that burning fossil fuels would warm the planet. Their senior ice researcher saying at the time, everybody knows that. So the oil industry nowadays says, "Oh, come on, it's a myth. Global warming's a myth, folks. Get off the bandwagon."
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? There's just that particular story was done by some investigative journalists with the LA Times, and they basically went back, looked at reports back in the 70s, 80s, video footage of people talking at conferences, scientists from Exxon giving statements at these conferences, one of the things being, just the complete admission that the greenhouse gases are forming, and it's because of fossil fuels, and nobody's even disputing that. And externally, Exxon is on the record as saying that these reports are spurious and speculative at best. And internally, there's all this paper trail and evidence that they were actually doing all this research to see how it would impact their business model, both positively and perhaps negatively. So one of the positive things they said was that the melting of the Arctic was likely to make it much easier for them to explore and develop resources in the Arctic, in the Beaufort Sea in particular. So in other words, there was upside. This is this perverse model where melting the Arctic is actually helpful to them in extracting more of the fuel that can melt the Arctic some more. On the other hand, of course, they were causing massive environmental impact to the rest of us who were, perhaps willfully, blindly, in many cases, not paying attention to the obvious facts here and believing the party line because it was easier for us to keep consuming fossil fuel products than make any actual stand or change. On the downside for the Exxon group, they were saying that they acknowledged that the rising sea levels and violent weather was likely to impact some of their offshore rigs and have a lot more damage to some of their equipment. So it is really, it brings us back to this whole idea that the corporate model is very, it can be extremely perverse. To the extent that it looks at everything on a net profit and return to shareholders basis, it's a very immoral model in many cases. It's the same thing that allowed certain people at, for example, Volkswagen to, fudge and fraud their results for many years, so that, they were literally saying that they were emitting much less than they actually were in terms of pollution into the environment. So, even though people knew that was happening, it ultimately was okayed for short-term profits and sales. They must have known. I mean, either they knew or they ought to have known that eventually that news would get out and the story would hit. I think the big problem here is that no one ever goes after the profits that went before. There's a fine paid or there's a future regulation change or something of that nature. But what we need to do is go back and disgorge profits that were made from the illicit activities, right? So I think that we really need a lot of class action lawsuits. There's no doubt going to be a lot of litigation lawyers who will be rubbing their hands in glee at the notion of willful blindness, of reckless endangerment, this sort of thing, from whether it be, Volkswagen, other car manufacturers, whether it be, the oil companies of the world who, in their own internal documents and speeches acknowledged that they were causing this impact to the world environment and yet continued anyway because it was profitable to do so. So at some point, and, when you and I were talking about the Volkswagen fraud a few weeks ago when it first came out, I said that I thought the best and most intelligent public relations move for Volkswagen now would be to just go straight to electric cars. Say, sorry, we screwed up. We were lying. It's true. Mea culpa. We'll pay a fine, but here's how we're going to fix that. From now on, we're going to double down on having zero emissions, never mind reduced emissions. And sure enough, yesterday an article comes out to say that they've decided this is where they should be investing. So they're cutting some of their short-term spending that they had planned and, moving it over towards bringing out a fully electric car. And I think, if anything good comes from this scandal, it will be that revelation that is the way of the future. And all sorts of car companies, Aston Martin's CEO was talking about the same thing. in the last week or so, they issued just saying that the future is electric, and it's really exciting, and they intend to double down on that. So I guess all these stories together, the revelations about what the oil companies knew and have, cost us all greatly in terms of the time to fix these issues in the world. We had this technology, back in the 70s. We could have easily taken a different turn, and the world could have been in a much more healthy place today, financially for sure, environmentally for sure. We could have wasted so much less and done so much less harm. Of course, we didn't do any of that. So now we have to play the catch-up game. But I guess at some point, as I say, typically we've needed a massive crisis in history before anyone really gets serious about changing behavior. So hopefully all these factors coming together, and as I say, this push for change in the world, this push back on corporations controlling governments, a lot of public unrest, booing in crowds, people coming out to vote in masses to try and get some change. Hopefully all of that will end up pushing us in a healthier direction.
I was going to say there are no booings at the Vancouver area all candidates meetings because the Conservatives have not shown up for them.
Yes, that's an interesting ploy, right? Because they haven't shown up in my area either. Not in my immediate town. They came to a couple. The last one, the Conservative candidate begged out, saying he couldn't attend. It was called away at the last minute. Same thing happened in a nearby town, Collingwood, that is near where we live. And so this is obviously a ploy that they don't want to show up and be booed, I guess. But I just think there must be respect for our processes, the judicial process, the independence of the judicial process, the independence of, the clean lines around how we are allowed to express our views and policy recommendations in the country. All these things have to be put through this filter, and any one power that comes in under whatever government or whatever party that tries to take away those basic rules and lines on the road and remove, make less disclosure, less transparency, they should be fought tooth and nail in my view, because they are truly threatening everything that has been good and built up over many years of fighting to get some decent rules in place.
Well, locally here too, former Surrey Mayor Dianne Watts is running for the Conservatives. She's the only Conservative candidate I know who has shown up for all candidate meetings, and she feels she is in such desperate trouble she is paying for her own radio ads. And usually that's considered to be a sign that a local candidate thinks they're in trouble when they decide to go and pay out of their own pocket instead of using the Conservative Party's money.
Or Donald Trump doing it himself because he says he doesn't want to be beholden to anyone, right? So there's different ways of looking at that, but I don't know. I think we have to all respect the process and realize how serious it is when someone tries to tamper with or have things swayed inappropriately. We're 2 stones away from a corrupt system once we start going down that road. Once we start trying to bribe people or pay people off. I mean, look around the world. That goes on all over the place. And whether it be in soccer, big sport, whether it be in regulatory factors, whether it be in, anything, I don't think anyone that's truly intellectually honest or strong that wants a robust system wants someone to placate and do everything they say. I think they want checks and balances in the system because that's what keeps it healthy and strong. So I hope that we start to appreciate that more and move back towards that kind of a model.
Is the reason that Trump seems to be so popular is because he's outside the so-called established political system?
Sadly, I don't think so. I think he may be perceived that way, and perhaps that's why, I think that's why Bernie Sanders, as an example, was getting quite a bit of applause. He's a plain-spoken person. He makes very definitive statements. Now, who knows what would happen if and when he gets into the position to actually be calling the shots? But certainly, he speaks in a more, quote, revolutionary way than the status quo. And perhaps Trump does that too. My worry is that the public has been dummied down so much, has become so intellectually lazy, that in general we just sort of lie back on our couch and let people entertain us, right? And I think that there's a great danger there that entertainers, the people who get the most eyeballs, like Donald Trump as an example,
or Ronald Reagan,
or whoever it is, right? If it's I think a lot of people vote with their gut, so to speak, how they feel, and they can be easily swayed, And again, back to finance, I see that in my own business all the time. I see people fooled by the wrong people, the people that are making the most reckless, dishonest or incorrect statements are attracting people because they seem nice or they seem smart or they tell them what they want to hear, right? They tell them that 1 + 2 is 7, and the people just say, "Oh, great, that's what I always hoped," and they'll go with that person. And I think, again, we have to come back to responsibility for our own democratic process, for our own choices, and for trying to filter facts and not just buy into what seems to be shiny and true, even though in your heart of hearts you probably have a feeling that it can't be true. If it's too good to be true, it is too good to be true, and I think that's where we need to be adults.
Danielle, thank you very much for chatting with us.
Thank you, Jim.
My guest has been Danielle Park, editor of the popular blog Juggling Dynamite and president of Venable Park Investment Council, Incorporated. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at Talk Digital Net. Our YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. You can forward comments to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.